Hey everyone, welcome to this new video where I'll be chatting with Brandon Shockley about brand tracking. Brand tracking is one of those areas that is very often not talked about in a very hands-on and understandable way. And Brandon really has the knowledge and understands what metrics to look at and how to put those against some of the new science we've seen from Ehrenberg, Bass Institute and others. So this is a really fascinating deep dive. And at the end of the video, Brandon shows us a really interesting demo on segmentation and some other more deep research stuff that's really interesting. So buckle up and let's talk branding.
I'm Brandon Shockley. I'm the VP of Research for 160 over 90, which is a branding and marketing agency.
Awesome. Before we dive into some of the actual topics, I always have this painfully excruciating round, which I call the definition round. Are you ready for that?
I am.
Cool.
Bring
So
it
bring it, bring it. I like the attitude. What is brand or a brand? Brandon. Wow, that's a lot of brand.
You're right. That's why I got into this. That's a good question with a lot of different answers. I think the way I usually talk about it is that a brand is a set of associations that people have. It's a set of things people remember and think about in relation to some product or some service. The reason that a brand exists is it helps people sort of know where it goes in their memory, sort of like filing. So the brand sort of is a way to say, this is where this came from, this is where this goes. And it connects to a lot of other memories, like what is this thing? What is it good for? What type of people use it? How would I use it? Things like that.
I like it. The filing cabinet. I can see it in front of me. And what is branding?
For me, branding is essentially creating those sort of things, which is kind of a funny idea because if brands are mostly in people's heads, if they are things people are thinking about, it's not really something you can ever own. It's not
Mhm.
something you can fully put down on a piece of paper. You are trying to support the creation of a brand that's in a lot of different people's minds and a lot of different people's perceptions. Um, Branding is really creating the assets that do that. So those might be visual and auditory assets. They might be a style of how you communicate. It's really the creation of everything to support that.
Love that. And how does it relate to marketing? What's that?
Marketing, you weren't lying. This is going to be the excruciating round of answers. So marketing. So there's two answers. I think there's a really practical, kind of boring, dry answer, and I think there's an answer that is more inspirational that I like. The practical answer is marketing is the area of business management that deals with your customers. So you only have a business if you have customers. You only have an organization if you serve somebody. So if you meet some need from a certain group that you're talking to, from a certain audience. So marketing is all the things in management that deal with that. It's sort of, if you think about it, then the core of management, right? So just like you have human resources, technology, sales, finance, all these other activities, all those things have to go back to some customer, right? That's where
Hmm.
your money in the business comes from ultimately. So that's sort of the practical definition, is this area of management that deals with the customer. One thing to point out about that is customer can have a really broad definition, right? So your customer might be someone you sell something to, or it could be a partner, um, it could be a regulator, and so on. The more inspirational definition that I like is by a guy named Larry Lockshin. He's a researcher, I believe he's part of Ehrenberg Bass, and he says marketing is the philosophy of satisfying the buyer. And I like that because I think it speaks to the idea of marketing not being a department. It's really more of a mindset. It's like saying innovation. If a
Yep.
company has an innovation department, that might be a red flag. Because that's something that's more of activity and a mindset. So I think that idea of the philosophy of satisfying the buyer is a little bit broader. And marketing overall is much broader than just branding or just advertising.
Yeah. Somebody quoting Ehrenberg Bass in the beginning of the interview always is a a good start for me. Um, so one of the topics we talked about beforehand was brand tracking, something you said you were specialized in and know a lot of. And this is an area where I'm really interested in. But maybe let's just start with the basics of what is brand tracking for you, and why does it matter?
Sure. Across a lot of different campaigns and projects and clients that we work with, brand tracking is really all the things we're doing to monitor the impact of the brand, how people think about it, what people see in the world, how they describe it, things they're remembering about it. So,
Mhm.
so those are sort of the things that are motivating us to do some kind of brand tracking. That's mostly through surveys. So we survey probably 50 to 60,000 people a year. That number goes up a little each year, mostly US and Canada for my team. And we're asking people about their awareness of the brand, what they think about it, how they use a category, if they've seen certain assets the brand uses. So those are some of the things that go into brand tracking and ideally measuring that over time. Um, I'm sure we'll get into this further into the conversation, but a lot of things in brand tracking move very slowly. Just like going to the doctor, you might go and measure something and say, okay, you're healthy, things look all right. You don't really expect to go and say, oh, you doubled your score in something. If you do, you might not be doing as well as you thought. And things can't really be reduced down to a simple set of scores or a simple set of numbers. The questions we're trying to answer in business, in marketing, typically are cause and effect type of questions of what would have happened if I didn't do this, or what was the impact of this campaign or this action. And those are very tough to answer with the regular brand tracker. So this gets to how you use a brand tracker and why it's important. Is a lot of a brand tracker is about learning about our past actions. It's not so much a scorecard or a report card to say what you did worked or didn't work, you're doing a good job or bad job, because there's so many other things happening. Where it's really helpful is understanding here's some of the kinds of things that can work, and here's what you can try in the future and experiment with.
Interesting. Like, I'm always really curious because I get asked this question a lot. Like, when is it actually a good idea to start brand tracking? Because I can imagine maybe for smaller organizations, this is like an area where they feel like maybe it's not for them or it's not useful. Like, what's your experience on that?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I almost always with clients, if I can, I ask the question, what's the cost of not doing research? So think about the world where you are doing this study or this project or something else. And if it's a low cost or no cost, then do something else.
Mm-hmm.
I'm infamous for talking people out of research because the most valuable information that you're ever going to get in marketing is marketing, right? It's going to be an experiment, it's going to be an A/B test, it's going to be launching things, interacting with customers. That's the most valuable information and content you can really ever get. So if you are a small brand, often the sort of problems you have to deal with, the sort of things you have to fix, may deal with distribution or product or other things, or just branding, just building the assets you need. So those are often for a smaller brand, some of the places you start. As you're expanding your activities, doing more variety of marketing, investing more in marketing, maybe there's more risk associated with it. That's where I think brand tracking becomes more valuable
Mm-hmm.
in understanding how people are responding. When you have a bigger audience and a bigger market you're addressing, that's where brand tracking and things can be helpful. Um, Overall, the most insight that I tend to see in market research comes from qualitative. I'm biased because I started my career in qualitative research, not quantitative, but I really feel like qualitative is where you get the sort of interaction and the human side that's going to inform messaging. So generally, that's what I'm usually telling people, especially for smaller brands. Like, if you can talk to your customers, talk to your customers. That's kind of the basis of where you start. But then as those other things start happening and you're expanding what you're doing, investing more, that's where brand tracking becomes important. Ideally, you're starting that before you're doing your campaign or making changes. So you have some sort of time series, some sort of baseline before things go
Yeah.
to market.
Yeah, I love that. I had a conversation last week with John Cohen about interviewing customers and how to talk to that. So it's nice you bring that back. Um, I do wonder. Let's get into a little bit of the weeds of brand tracking. What are the metrics we're looking at? I mean, there's been a lot of debate lately about traditional metrics versus new metrics. Take us through what is important to you and how you do it.
Yeah, and I'll try not to take the entire rest of our time just talking about this because it's a very philosophical question for me, and I sit around with my team and we talk about pros and cons of a lot of different metrics. So I think the big picture idea is the really important questions we want to answer can't be answered with numbers.
Hmm.
That's a really kind of overall philosophy about business that not everyone agrees with. A lot of times the motivation for brand tracking is to find a number that's an answer. People really want to know, how did I do? And they want the number that says I did well, or I did pretty good, or I did better than someone else. That's a lot of the motivation. So when you take a step back, part of it is understanding, what are we really trying to do? And it's sort of like if you take a flight somewhere and someone says, how was your flight? Oh, it was 113 minutes and this was our air speed and we had this many knots and so on. That would be a really weird answer to that question. When someone asks you how your flight was, they want to know, well, was it the way you expected? Were you comfortable? And the idea in your mind of what the flight would be, did reality match that? And that's not something that there's individual numbers for. So for any metrics, that's part of what I think people have to get comfortable with. And hopefully that's what I see as part of my job, is getting people comfortable with ambiguity. There's not total black and white answers to any of this. And I'll talk about some of the things we do measure, but that's like the big picture thing we're trying to accomplish.
Hmm.
Awareness is a one you pretty much are always going to be measuring in some form. That can be aided awareness, so prompting people with a list or with imagery. That can be unaided. With unaided, one thing I notice is that's sort of relevant to very particular categories and things that are going to come to mind in a sort of spontaneous way.
Hmm.
That's going to be related to a lot of other things you're trying to do in building those memories we talked about your brand. But there are certain categories where the main thing you're trying to figure out isn't about unaided awareness. You're not going to be sitting at home and say, what's the defense contractor that I think is the most reliable or something? There's certain categories where you're looking at that category in list and with information and in a certain sort of buying process. So you don't necessarily need to be at the tip of someone's tongue.
Yeah,
But
sorry to interrupt you there. I just wanted to share this story because it just came up today. Like, my wife is really loving this new brand of shoes. She bought them. They're really cool, very distinctive. And the funny thing is, like, you could say those shoes are really top of mind for her. But today, like, I was talking about the shoes and said, like, what was the brand name again? And she couldn't come up with the brand name. She could tell you how the shoes look like, so it's very much top of mind. But I think that's one of the problems with also unaided awareness is maybe you really unconsciously or visually have the brand, but you can't say which one it is. Just an idea.
yeah, yeah, and a lot of people's perception and whether they buy those shoes or not, their response is situational. It's based
Yeah.
on the environment and a lot of other things. So um, building unaided awareness is one of those things that you can put a lot of focus on, but it might not be solving the underlying problem, the
Yeah.
underlying challenge. But awareness is one big category that you're going to measure in some way or another. There are a variety of things around consideration, but those essentially are trying to measure some sort of behavioral intent. Is this a brand you're open to? Would you try it? Would you purchase it? How likely are you to X, Y, Z? So that's kind of one category of metrics. Those might vary a little bit depending on the category and how you want to ask it. There's very straightforward ways to ask it and just say, here's a list. Which of these would you be open to buying? How likely
Mhm.
you'd buy it? There might be more sophisticated ways where you rank them and in a succession of different questions. Um, Penetration is, we know, is sort of the most important thing of all. It's sort of like the granddaddy of all metrics. Everything is correlated with it. Everything comes out of it in one way or another. So that's good to measure. It's tricky for things that are self-reported because certain categories, your memory of it may not be totally accurate. There are different things that can crop up in the research as far as how accurate that measure is. But penetration and current use, past use, things like that are part of it. A big category, and I think relevant to a lot of things we're talking about, are brand image attributes, which is that's
Mhm.
where when you go on marketing Twitter and we all start arguing, it's about which brand image attributes, how should you track them, do they matter? So we do track brand image attributes. Over the past few years, we've changed a lot of what we do based on some of the research out of Ehrenberg Bass. So as much as possible, we've revised those attributes to try to get to things which are part of the category decision or relevant to something in the category. So measuring things like fun or interesting or innovative, those are things I think marketers are really interested in, because you want to have a survey and say, my product is innovative. Everyone in the survey said so. The problem is, if you're in a category that's high technology, everyone's innovative, and they're innovative in line with their market penetration. So not really adding something when you measure some of those. So that's some of the brand image side, and then linking those to things that actually are part of a decision-making process. A couple other things which we've found are really effective, and again, based on that same research, are measuring how many of those attributes is a brand associated with. So I've heard some researchers talk about this as the associative rate. So how many traits are you associated with? So if there are 10 different positive brand attributes for your category and you're associated with 5 of them on average, then you have a 50% associative rate. That number we've seen in a lot of research tends to be really informative. It tends to move with advertising. It follows the strength of sort of brands and different brand assets and things like that. So that's one that's really useful. Another is very related. It's associative penetration. How many people can associate you with at least one thing, right? So it's sort of how many people know something about you. We're really seeing that those are a lot more informative and a lot more effective than measuring familiarity. And that's one that I personally have a gripe with, that I usually tell people, just delete familiarity, just throw it away, because how familiar we are with something is individual. If you say you're somewhat familiar with podcasting, and I say, oh, I'm very familiar, I listen to podcasts all the time, I certainly am not more familiar with podcasts than you make one. But it's an individual scale, and where you are on that scale can move. So that's something we try to get away from, is any of those really subjective scales. We stopped measuring favorability a while ago for that reason, because that information is contained in a lot of the other metrics, and it's again sort of a subjective scale. For brand image, also going back to that for one moment, we measure that with a sort of pick any that apply sort of scale. So it's sort of a yes/no basically. So it's not something that's subjective of, is this a 4 in the innovation scale or a 5? Because again, that's going to vary from person to person and maybe not be the most informative.
So
those are
to interrupt there. So you're basically asking, do you think brand X is innovative? And the answer is yes or no?
So we're doing for a set of brands. Let's say we have 4 brands. It's which of the following, if any, are innovative. That's a trait. And we wouldn't use innovative as the example. It might be something more relevant to the decision someone's making. But have this particular trait. And then there would be, you could select as many or as few as you wanted, or a none for that attribute. So it's very similar to, I think there's been some work that Rachel Kennedy or Jenny Romanek put out. And so we're using that same sort of free choice, pick any scale for that, where it's, grid question. So those are some of the main ones. There's some that I think are a little less common that are also really valuable. Brand recognition of brand assets, I should say, which again is directly based on Jenny Romanek's work. I can't say enough good things about Ehrenberg Bass. I'm not being paid by them. I'm just plugging things that are useful and have worked. But measuring the fame of an asset, so recognition of an asset and uniqueness, how many people correctly identify it with a particular brand, the brand you're looking for. So that's helpful to track, and we do see that move with campaigns. Going into more the advertising side and measuring things like advertising recall, that can be tricky because we know that's biased based on penetration and certain other things in the survey. But measuring ad recall aided can be helpful. So we'll often ask if people have seen any advertising in the category. If they have unaided, who is it for? And then we'll ask aided, prompting them with a list. There's another one we'll ask that, I forget the exact source of this when we started doing this, but it's called proven recall. So for people who have seen ads, we'll actually ask them to play back the content of that advertising. So we'll say, did you see an advertisement for sporting goods? And you'll say, yes, and it was this, I think it was this, prompted with a list, click this brand. Okay, tell me things you remember from this ad. Any things that you remember seeing or hearing in the content. that can be helpful just because it helps us understand what are some of the things that people actually take out of the messaging. What are some of the things that are that are sticky to people that they can sort of connect with and remember. And it also gives you a sense of some of the most memorable traits, things that might be more relevant to people. We ask that as open-ended, and then we'll code the different answers from that, which is something we try to do as much as possible. If you do it too much, it makes your surveys not fun for the participant. But we try to do as much of that so we're not forcing people into a certain uh, biased answer that we think because we're doing the marketing.
Love that. So many things I want to dive into. Maybe one of the first things I think is very interesting because obviously we've talked about Ehrenberg Bass and double jeopardy laws and these law-like patterns that emerge and that you have probably seen in the research. And I'm wondering, like, do you ever see divergence from those laws, and is that where you take the learnings for the brand, or is everything just perfectly law-like? And then there's the question, of course, like, why do we actually brand track, and can we learn from these things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question and something that sort of again gets to the philosophy of why we're doing it and what it's useful for. Um, so as far as the law-like patterns, things aren't perfectly law-like, but I think the research and what Ehrenberg Bass talks about, I think establishes that that's part of the theory.
Yeah.
And it's not to say, I think the thing that gets maybe overlooked or maybe oversimplified a little bit is the idea that people follow these sort of mechanical laws and patterns to make a purchase decision or to remain loyal to a brand or not. And people have a million different reasons. People have diets that change what they eat. Things are out of stock. They take offense with something that someone who works for a brand said. There's this whole rich diversity of things that do impact people and their individual choices. It's just that those individual choices end up in aggregate, in
Yeah.
total, being very, very close to this sort of probability model, um, which I think is more the thing that's cool about that to me is it's this really complicated, theoretical, data-driven explanation for things that are just really simple. So at the end of the day, when you go through all the Ehrenberg Bass research, all of how brands grow, it's you need to be easy to think of, you need a product that works, and people need to be able to find it. And
Mm-hmm.
there's really, really robust data demonstrating all those things, but we don't necessarily go and plot all of our clients on a Dirichlet distribution or something like that. But it is helpful to think about it that across a large population for product that has for a large product category, you're going to see some of those patterns, and you can think a little more broadly. You can have some more freedom to be creative, to be daring, knowing that you don't compete in some narrow category of one beverage or one type of product. You compete really broadly with the whole need state, and you can find different places to play in that. You can find different ways to grow how well people think of you or how accessible you are. So that's sort of how we think about it and how we use it in practice. We're not talking clients through it. I think clients would probably throw me out of the building if I started drawing, a Dirichlet curve during a meeting. So it's not so much that; it's more like the philosophy behind it. Um, we do see deviations from it, but I think it's not necessarily something that there are no exceptions to. I think there's been a lot of really good work over the years about what the types of exceptions are and where you see that, where those
Mm-hmm.
might be opportunities. One area is certain things which I think are kind of polarizing to people, like when marketing Twitter, we all argue about brand purpose or not,
Yeah.
and that's seen as this pick a side debate where either people are really deeply invested in companies having a purpose and changing the world, or people are completely probabilistic and are and are just care about the bottom line and all this sort of stuff. And we've done research, especially this year. Brands are thinking about this a lot. They're focused on diversity. They're focusing on their social impact and climate. And we've done a lot of qualitative and quantitative research that brand purpose has an impact. It has an
Mm-hmm.
impact in the ways that fit within that theory, that it helps a brand. It can take away purchase barriers. If you have a negative that you create in the category, if you create waste or there's bad press about you, that doesn't help you sell your product or your service, right? So That's part of it. Another thing that, and I wouldn't say this is a deviation from Ehrenberg Bass, but something that's interesting is in that area of brand purpose, people do have a sense of fairness. People have a sense that companies that are powerful, that are wealthy, have significant influence, should try to use that influence in a fair, positive way. That it should have a broad benefit, mainly through the product they offer and having it work properly for them. But they shouldn't neglect things in society. They shouldn't be greedy. They should have fair employment practices and all these sorts of things. So that does have an impact on brand impressions. We tend to see that it's a supportive impact. It's, very few people, if anyone, is basing their decisions and basing their perceptions on that. But if there's a product they like that can reinforce the things they like about that product, that they see that here's another way I can think about this brand, have it be mentally available. I'll give you a quick example. We do a lot of work with the Philadelphia Eagles. I'm in Philadelphia. I'm a big Eagles fan, and they are one of the most sustainable sports organizations in the world. Their stadium is the most sustainable sports facility in the world, and it has windmills attached to it and all these great energy and climate saving things. And people aren't going to the football game to look at the windmills, but we can show in qualitative and quantitative research that reinforces existing positives. That adds to that network of things people know about the brand in a positive way. So that's one of those where it's not a deviation maybe from what Ehrenberg Bass talks about, but it's maybe just a nuance in the real world. One other quick thing, because you bring this to mind, is I think sometimes as research people, as people working with data, we overlook the role of diplomacy in what we do. And I say this knowing that a lot more people would adopt ideas from Ehrenberg Bass and from how brands grow if it was presented a different way, or if it maybe made people see it as accessible to them and relevant to them. And someone told me recently this great quote, which I've been using a lot, which is smart people make you feel stupid, brilliant people make you feel smart. And we don't do that enough in market research, is making our clients and making our colleagues feel smarter. And I think sometimes we lecture people about how brands grow. We have these Twitter debates of a bunch of people that no one's ever heard of. If you have a typical person about people in marketing, they're talking about Elon Musk and crypto and stuff. They don't know who any of us are. We're having these fights on Twitter. It's like no one's thinking about this. So that just goes to that same point of like how do you make this stuff useful and practical? And it's a little more of like, as a team, right? As an agency and client, how do we build a collective expertise to do really good marketing? It's not necessarily that set of scores, or metrics we're trying to get to. So I don't know if I actually answered the question.
I mean, it's really interesting, and I mean the whole purpose debate. We're not gonna get into it, but I
Yeah,
agree.
sure.
It's so contextual, and I like your example. I think one element that is really interesting here is, in general, I think the idea of doing research is something that is often overlooked. I think especially a lot of people in brand strategy, they like to think about defining the brand and so on, but using insights to really create a brand strategy. I'm curious as to how you translate the things you learn from brand tracking or other qual and quant stuff into something that might be a brand strategy, or I don't know how you define that, but I'm curious about that gap and what happens there.
Yeah, that's something we think about a lot. So for a little bit of context, we actually created our practice around that idea.
Okay.
And the challenge was because before I was part of 160/90, this is going back many years. Like a lot of agencies, they worked with external market research partners,
Mm-hmm.
external data partners. Doing this in house was motivated by that exact challenge of how do you take this and actually make it fit within the types of work we do in marketing consulting. And the basis was of that idea was this: there's no client who has a lack of data. Most of the things we're doing in market research have this assumption that, oh, we just need to get more information. We need to get more data. In reality, people have way too much data. If you actually talk to clients, if you look at brands and what they're dealing with, there's data everywhere, and people don't know what to do with it. So the real thing you're trying to figure out is how to take data, a lot of disparate existing data, and bring it into one cohesive story. And that's the core motivation of everything we're doing. That's sort of why we look into some of these theories and use things like machine learning and stuff when maybe other market research practices aren't. because those things help us tell that story. They help us make it relevant to something that someone has to solve or build or do in real life. And so that's kind of big picture what we're trying to do with market research. Some specific things in that. Partly, we're lucky that we're not a separate third-party research agency. So the
Mm-hmm.
people we sit next to and people we collaborate with are strategists and creatives and the accounting team. Our function, so market research in our agency, is within strategy. And there are probably other agencies where that's the norm, but we work directly with those teams, supporting the work they do, developing primary research, and sort of in the same way that a strategist collaborates with the creative to get great brand strategy, to get great briefs and an insight driven sort of story, we're doing that with the strategist. We're understanding what are the things in your brief you're trying to figure out? What are the experiments that we can come up with together to pressure test these things in market? What are the unanswered questions? And so that's part of that process of closing the gap. The other is similar to some things we were talking about earlier. The other is that a lot of things aren't that useful for actual marketers. So sitting next to those people and working with them, we find out that no one's writing a brief and looking at the favorability numbers and things like that. People really want to understand when they're making marketing decisions, what type of person buys this or not? What are the barriers that get in the way? How do we compare to others on some of those barriers, some of those perceptions? So that's the kind of stuff that we focus our research on. That creates a real seamless handoff as we're going from the research to the strategy to creative. And we essentially work in parallel the whole time so that the research folks are really embedded in strategy. The strategy folks are really embedded in research. And there's no Wizard of Oz moment where you go and say, okay, it's going into data world and something will happen and it'll come back with some numbers or a really long slide deck that no one reads. So that's kind of just a cultural thing that helps us close that gap.
Interesting. Just this might be a little bit technical, but I'm curious as to the brand tracking stuff. Have you guys developed your own software or using existing tools and survey tools, or how does that work?
Yeah, we use existing tools. There's a few different partners and vendors we work with, but we use Qualtrics pretty extensively, which is really massive platform. One thing for context and for folks listening, we do a ton of work in higher education. We're actually the biggest higher ed agency, as for that category in the U.S., maybe the world, I guess. But so we have a lot of clients who also use the platform, which is helpful for certain things. If we're helping, say, set up a survey, then launch it from the client's platform, or we're launching from ours. So Qualtrics is a big one. Big fans of Qualtrics, and continue to work with them really closely. We also use YouGov, which is a sort of all-in-one panel and research tool that we've worked with quite a bit. If you see polls in The Economist, they're often Economist YouGov polls or publication / YouGov poll, whichever publication it is. So that's one we've had a lot of good success with, uh, a lot of good luck in applying it in a client context. It's very fast. That's one of the things that's really good about YouGov. You can do fast research on any platform, but YouGov is very quick. So they're doing these rolling surveys so you can sort of get space in. They also have a lot of profile points on other surveys the same person has taken. So if you take a survey about your demographics, and then I have a survey that's about cat food or about TV shows, I can see the same demographic information. So I can have a shorter, more engaging survey, and I can sort of append that to what I'm doing. So we use that a lot as you get into the sort of machine learning world where we say we want to segment people or run an algorithm or do those sort of things because we have a lot more data per person, even though we're only asking 5 or 10 questions. Those would be the main two that we're using for brand tracking.
Yeah, interesting. Um, I need to get this question before I forget it because it's always like a tricky one. I have some other ones, but salience and category entry points. You
Yeah.
knew it was coming, right? Like, do you use that concept, that model in your tracking, and how do you deal with it? Because it seems like it's conceptually it makes complete sense, but I don't see a lot of practitioners knowing how to work with it.
Yeah, we do. First off, we're big fans of both. It's a little tricky, you're right, in how we translate it into the work we're doing. So that's something that we've spent a lot of time, and probably the past 3-ish years, 2 to 3 years, we've spent figuring out how to make that operational and actually put it into work. A lot of that is based on research that we see from Byron Sharp and Rachel Kennedy and other people who have worked on this, Jenny Romanek, who I mentioned, who've worked on this really closely. Um, so we do use two of those metrics that I mentioned. Associative rate is very linked to the idea of salience. That's one of their sort of minds, mental market share. Those kind of
Yep.
metrics they're using are sort of based on that idea. So we are using that, and we'll measure some of those traditional attributes, image attributes, and things like that. But we'll also look at it in the context of salience of those measures. The great thing about those is it's really easy to get buy-in for that because you're not adding questions to a survey, so you don't need to change the survey design if you're already asking image attributes, and they don't cost anything, other than some additional analyst time. So we are using those. As far as category entry points, as much as possible, we're trying to make those brand image attributes linked to category entry points.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where, if whenever we can, and it's tough with time constraints and being remote in COVID, but when we can, we want to understand that problem solving process. What problem does a customer actually have? Why do people actually use this category? And that's going to inform some of the image attributes we ask about. So knowing that people who drink a certain wine want something that's going to be pleasant for everyone at their gathering, because one of the things they worry about is someone who doesn't like the wine and then they don't have a good time or something. So maybe that's something that the versatility or it appealing to a lot of people in a group. Maybe that's something important to them when they select the wine. So that might be something you ask about in as a brand image attribute. So category entry points are valuable for that, and that is something we try to compare across brands. But we're big fans of that category entry points kind of idea, that people do have. There's sort of a door you walk through to get into the category. There's a lot of different doors, and whatever that need is, those things are really practical for strategists, right? To your earlier question about how do we close the gap, those are things you can directly deal with in strategy. If you're selling graham crackers, s'mores are a great way to sell graham crackers. That's a category entry point. Camping, s'mores, there's a whole world you can occupy there and build upon. That's not just saying, oh, here's another thing that can go into your pantry that you forget you have. So so that's some of the ways that salience and category entry points work into our surveys.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I figured like the brand image assets because you mentioned earlier about the fact that the more you can own, the better. And that's also there's an interesting opposite there with traditionally what we call positioning or trying to own one attribute. And I guess that comes back to the whole Ehrenberg Bass Institute point on differentiation. But I am curious about your take on that quickly because I have one more other big question for you.
Yeah, sure. So I'm completely with you on that as far as how we think about positioning. And I had a big shift in this based on reading How Brands Grow and then this digging into the research papers around it. But the comparison I've made before and in an earlier talk I've given about using machine learning in marketing, the way we've thought about positioning before is kind of like a card game. It's like if you and I are playing poker, there's only one ace of diamonds, and that might be the winning card for this hand, but I want to be the one who has it, and it's a little bit random, and I can switch some, but I just want to have the best cards in my hand. And really, that's not the game we're playing at all with positioning. As we learn more about it, as we do more research and actually find out what's going on, it's actually the game Monopoly. I just want to be in as many places as I can. I want those things to be next to each other so they're connected, and but really that's the thing. There aren't necessarily bad attributes, and there are negative traits you could associate with. But for positive things, you want a broad range of positive things you're associated with. People have no problem remembering those, and they help you come to mind more easily. The challenge is which do you go after because you have limited resources, and so really it's a resource and focus problem for positioning. But competing for the same attributes that are important in the category is a good thing. They're important because people look for those when they have a problem or want to buy something.
I love that. I love the fact that you mentioned Monopoly and like maybe even the idea that connecting streets first, like clusters
Yeah.
of entry points or image attributes, and then going beyond. I really like that philosophy. Um,
The only thing we're missing is we can't trade brand attributes. If we could, then we would have proven athlete, and we'd say, okay, your brand's going to take this, I'll swap this. But unfortunately,
Love the metaphor. That's a really great metaphor. Um, Maybe to wrap this up, two more things. One is you were you said you wanted to show something. I'm curious about that. But before that, one more question about research in general. And I know this is gonna be a little bit more of like a more of a vague question, but I always have this discussion with both clients and students, like how much research is enough.
mm-hmm. um, that is a very good question. I think I'm probably on there's probably a spectrum from people who want to research everything and want to have really extensive research in every possible scenario. So I'm toward the opposite end of the spectrum of that. I think we should do research. Really, I think research should be part of the strategy and marketing process. I think in a
Mm-hmm.
perfect world, it's not a separate thing where we try to find something out and then act on it. Going back to really your first set of questions, if marketing is how we deal with customers and serve some need that people have, how we fix a problem, if that's kind of the whole point, research is at the center of that. So there should be some ongoing process where we are hearing from customers, doing research, testing things that we think or that we assume. So I think I try to do things in an agile way so we learn something we can build on. So
Yep.
that's why qualitative research is one where for the effort you put in, you can just get so much back in what you learn, in how you can apply that to messaging. And those things are only going to make your job easier when you have to do a survey later or when you want to look at social media listening or tracking earned media. Those are all things in our toolkit. Those are all things we use, but having a foundation and building on it is I think always going to be more productive. So in general, the things you can do within your set of resources where you can learn and then have the ability to change or do more, I think is always going to be the best.
Yeah. One more small question before we dive into the example. Um, I'm always curious about like how you look at behavioral versus surveys and asking people, because for example recently the rise of share of search as a metric is more of like a behavioral type of metric where you're looking at how people are actually searching for brands and stuff like that. Like what's your take on the whole behavioral part versus brand tracking, which is often more of a survey based?
Yeah. Uh, we could have done this for the whole for the whole podcast.
Just a small
Yeah,
question.
it's like an hour long. We could have a full like seminar on this. To try to talk about it quickly, I guess. Um, so behaviors we're typically trying to influence a behavior, and we know that behaviors are really important to understanding past and future behavior.
Yep.
And but that's also not the whole picture. We know that people have very rich mental life and ideas about themselves and others that influence those behaviors and make expectations that change their behavior. So it is helpful to try to measure that and understand it. Surveys aren't necessarily the ideal way to do that. There isn't really a great way to do it. Like if we think about some things we talked about earlier, we're trying to build that set of memories and those associations. And I don't know how human memory works. I don't think it's a 7-point scale or in a checkbox form. So taking the surveys of behavior, and we're trying to learn things about that. And so all the issues we run into in asking the survey question, in how people understand it, in the types of responses they can give us, all those things constrain how much we can really understand from the surveys too. So I generally try to think about research as there not being any sort of silver bullet as far as a particular method. I'm really interested in. I'm really excited by the stuff that James Hankins has done
Mm-hmm.
and Les Binet and Share Search. I think that's really cool, and we should be talking about that kind of stuff. Those are new ways to supplement things we're already doing. I don't know enough about Serif Search in particular,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of how it works over time. But I listened to your episode with James. I thought it was awesome. And so it's sort of a yes and, I guess, if I can do a
Yeah.
cop out and not really answer your question. It's
No, I
ideally
get
we
that. I mean, there's so much nuance to this answer that
yeah,
it's hard to do that in a couple of minutes. But
yeah,
I appreciate your answer, and I think it's a great starting point. Um,
cool.
you were going to show us
Yeah,
something. So for the listeners, if you want to check it out, go check out the YouTube version of this.
awesome. Thanks. I know we're coming up toward the end of our time, so I'll work through this pretty quickly, but we talked a little bit about some of the areas we do a lot of work in, and segmentation being one of them. So one of the things, again, when we created our practice, a big motivation was not to have this gap between research and between strategy. So the folks
Mm-hmm.
who are doing this research and doing machine learning and those kinds of things work right alongside strategists. Over the course of many, many segmentations, we've ran into some challenges that led to this approach, which is very, like a lot of things we've talked about, it's very inspired by Byron Sharp, but I'll give some examples of that. So just as a sort of high level thinking about segmentation, there's some assumptions that underlie segmentation that we accept, or at least are kind of informing us doing it. So it's worthwhile to just go through those.
Mm-hmm.
We assume the total market is made up of distinct groups. If there's only one type of person, or there's only a single customer, we don't need to do a segmentation. For any market of n individuals, they're between 2 and n segments. So if I have 100 people, I don't have 1,000 segments. I have at least a person a segment, and hopefully a few segments that have lots of different groups of people in it. If you go really deep in the weeds on some of the kind of machine learning side of this, there are segmentations that will have empty segments. There are types of segmentation that can have segments that don't have people in them, or can have people who aren't in segments. It might just segment the people who are in the most tightly clustered groups. But in general, that's an assumption we can work with.
Mm-hmm.
Third, segments can be identified in the market and large enough to matter. So that makes sense. That's why we're doing the segmentation. And this is one that gets overlooked a lot, but the benefits of targeting segments outweigh the cost of segmentation. It's not always true that just because we can identify the segments, that it's worthwhile to differentiate our strategy or our message to different groups. Oftentimes, we're really trying to find that broad message that works across segments. We might
Yeah.
prioritize because of the lack of resources, but really in the segmentation and the approach we've adopted, we're trying to get closer to targeting the whole market. And that's one of the reasons you'll see why we've sort of moved in this direction as opposed to some of the traditional techniques for segmentation. So one of the things, again, working with our clients and problems we've run into and trying to sort of innovate, maybe not use the traditional toolkit, there's some common issues that clients frequently cite in doing segmentation. So one is that demographic segmentation can miss nuances. There's a lot of uh, different things that can underlie behavior that can create it, and the way people look doesn't necessarily inform the way they have to behave, the way they have to think. The thing that demographics have in their favor, that they really do better than pretty much anything, is you can see them. You can really identify people based on their household size and their gender and income and those sort of traits. So that makes it really powerful in that sense, but it can miss a lot. So the other end of the spectrum, there's psychographics. So there's these attitudes that people have, and we can get this really rich picture of someone's underlying motivations and their lifestyle and culture, et cetera. But the big challenge with that is it's hard to apply to new data. Unless everyone who comes into the car dealership is going to take a 10-minute survey, it's hard to figure out what segment they belong in. Different models can really disagree about the number and types of segments, which is also a challenge. And it's not always clear how to test segmentation against new data. So that was the biggest motivation for this stream of work that we've done for a couple of years now, which is how do we prove a segmentation wrong? We say there are 4 types of people. How do we guarantee there are 4, not necessarily guarantee, but how can we be confident that there are not 6 or not 3, or that if we went after 3, that it wouldn't be better or worse? So we wanted some way to kind of pressure test some of those assumptions. This is inspired by a couple pieces of work from folks from Ehrenberg Bass. So again, I posted this on Twitter a few times. So I'm going to do a quick example. This is when we introduce clients to the idea of machine learning as part of research and how it
Mm-hmm.
works, right? So this is going to use the movie The Titanic. So with help from Jack and Rose, we're going to build a model to predict who survives. So you can think of this as a segmentation with 2 segments. You're either in the segment of people who survive or who don't. And I apologize if you have not seen the movie or if you have not heard of The Titanic. The Titanic is a tragic story. Jack will not survive. So we build the model. The Titanic, everyone's familiar with it. It's very clear and easy to visualize, and it's public data. And typically, when you're learning machine learning, when you're building your skills, it's a data set a lot of people work from because it's a very clear outcome and it's a small data set and so on. So the data set gets fed to the model. So the model essentially is getting fed this to learn patterns, and it doesn't understand anything about what a ship is or a ticket number. It's not necessarily looking for those particular patterns. It just knows that the column we want to predict is if you make it off the ship or not. Did you get to a lifeboat or not? And so there's different steps that go into it, but you feed the data to the model. The type of model we use, and this is inspired by some of that work, that segmentation work we talked about, is a decision tree. So what a decision tree is doing is saying, what is the variable that does the best job of splitting people into these categories? So what's the single variable that does the best job of splitting people into survivors or not? And then it repeats that process until you can't go any farther. So in this case, the first and most important variable, which shows up at the top of the tree, it's kind of like an upside down tree, is sex. So if you're a guy, you're predicted not to survive. So Steph, you and I are out of luck based on this model, right? So and the interesting thing is we don't explain to the model the idea that people leave a sinking ship in order based on sex, or that that's part of the process. It just finds that in the data, which is pretty cool. If you are female, then it depends on other variables. So then the next biggest variable depends on essentially how many people you're traveling with, the combined number of siblings and spouses on board. If it's over a certain number, you didn't make it. If it's under a certain number, maybe you made it. And so this process goes on in terms of parents and children on board, what class you're in, and then depending if you're second or third class, what your age was or what fare you paid. And using this model, you can get a correct prediction that Rose is going to make it off. Again, sorry for that. Although I do contend, based on the movie, there was enough room on the board for both of them to drive the Titanic. That's a whole other controversy that I'm not going to start at the end of your show. But so what does this look like when we apply it to actual data, right? So this is from a study of about 2,000 people based on them donating to a client organization. This is all fake data. It's redacted. But we ask a question, basically someone saying they're a somewhat to very likely donor or a neutral to unlikely donor. And this has flaws, right? Because we've validated this and we know not everyone who says they're likely won't donate, and not everyone who says they won't will stay true to that. So people move between these groups. But if you do that, you get a tree that looks like this. So there's a lot on this slide, but basically what we found is the biggest variable, the most important one in telling us if someone's going to donate or not, is their average gift amount. So that past behavior, which is often the case, is a great predictor of future behavior. If you go to the right, if it was less than or equal to a certain number, then it became a question of were they willing to volunteer, which is something we measured in the survey. And depending on your answer to that, you get these different segments. So segment 4, as one example, is 2/3 of the audience, but about half of donors. So they under-index, but as a group, they're actually the biggest single group of both people and of donors. So you can't neglect that group, but they're not necessarily the most responsive. And as we then drill down into these, we found things out about this group that, this was the younger group. They're focused on their family and career. They don't have as much time and money to invest. So what are some of the things that you can do to support that group in building affinity now for people who are going to be donors and philanthropists later, is one example. If you go the other direction, it comes down to things like, did you attend a certain event? And then once again, the average gift amount. So there's actually an interaction effect there, a threshold of if you didn't attend a particular event, then your gift amount becomes important again. So there's a lot here, but this is just a little bit of an idea of one of the ways you can really practically use machine learning and to do a segmentation. And the awesome thing about this is that we can actually test this, right? So we can actually look at how accurate is this model. In this case, this model was about 74% accurate at answering that question on the prior slide, right? At saying who's going to be in which of these groups. So that's really why we're using this. And we found that it's really fruitful in then developing messaging and strategies that let us target the whole market, right? Every segment has donors in it that we want to reach. It's figuring out how do we do that in a way that's going to work across these 5 groups based on the information we have.
Great stuff. I mean, this is like it's opening up a lot of ideas in my mind. So we should have probably do we should probably do a whole episode just on that part, segmentation, because it seems really interesting. But I do want to thank you for opening up the box at least and showing us what's inside. And thank you for the conversation. It was super interesting.
I had a blast. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing your other guests too. It's an awesome show, and I appreciate the invite.
Thanks. Brandon, if people want to reach out, where can they find you?
Twitter is a good place to reach me. I'm pretty active on that. At Shockley underscore MRX is my Twitter handle. And I'll tweet this link to this episode whenever it comes out. So I'll be probably in the comment section of this thread. But Twitter's a good way to reach me, and or LinkedIn, I guess, would be the other one.
Alright, that was it for the video. If you're interested in learning more about brand tracking, competitive analysis, customer research, everything brand strategy research basically, go check out my latest course on brand strategy. You can find it at brandstrategyresearch.com. And if you use the code YouTube, you'll get a 20% discount because you watch till the end, and that makes you very awesome. Thanks, and see you in the next video.